Welcome back to The Heat as we continue with CCTV's special election night coverage of the U.S. presidential race. Within the next few hours, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump is expected to become the new president-elect of the United States, and whoever wins will be sworn into office in January. What will a new U.S. presidency mean for China-U.S. ties in what many now regard as the world's most important bilateral relationship? The world's two largest economies will have to deal with major areas like trade.
Our jobs are fleeing the country. They're going to Mexico. They're going to many other countries. You look at what China is doing to our country in terms of making our product.
Well, when I was Secretary of State, we actually increased American exports globally 30%. We increased them to China 50%.
And how will both sides navigate issues such as disputes over the South China Sea? There's also the issue of preventing nuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. Joining us now from Beijing is Victor Gao. He is a Chinese international relations expert, and he's the director of the China National Association of International Studies. Also with us from California is Abraham Safair. He is Senior Fellow Emeritus with the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Victor, let's talk about China's role in this election. China has featured very strongly in the campaign so far. We have Donald Trump, who's accusing China of unfair trade practices, of taking away American jobs. We've got Hillary Clinton, who's also been tough on China on trade issues, arguing that she can do better than Trump. Trump, for his part, is calling for a 45% increase on tariffs on Chinese imports. What do you think a Trump or a Clinton presidency will mean for China-U.S. trade relations?
Thank you very much for having me. As far as China is concerned, China does not have a direct role in the presidential election in the United States. It seems that China bashing seems to be the fashion, both for Donald Trump as well as for Hillary Clinton. But I sincerely hope that whoever who wins the election, either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, once he or she moves into the White House with the heavy responsibilities of the presidency on his or her shoulder, he or she may need to wake up to the reality of the fact that China-U.S. relations are, after all, the most important relations in the world today, and better handle the relations between China and the United States will be good for both the national interest of the United States as well as for China. China-U.S. bilateral trade is almost $600 billion, and no other pair of bilateral relations in the world today is more important than China-U.S. relations. So let us hope that the next president of the United States will be more realistic after he or she moves into the White House, and let us hope that there will be a steady hand applied to the China-U.S. relations in the new presidency.
Abraham, when it comes to the United States trade and economic relations in the region, we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's the huge U.S. initiative. That's the U.S. and 11 countries, which excludes China. Hillary Clinton has told us that she once favored that agreement. Now she says she doesn't favor the TPP, as it's known. What do you see happening to the TPP under a new administration here in Washington?
Thanks for having me. I think the TPP was flawed because it excluded China. There are some reasons that have been given for excluding China, but I'm pretty sure China sees it as a competitive aspect to the relationship. I think trade between China and the U.S. is extremely important. It has grown very fast, and it is very robust. It would be a huge mistake to expect a relationship that's developed this quickly to be in any way perfect. I recall from my days in the State Department that we used to talk about Japan being a great threat to the United States in the 80s because of the trade, and the trade deficit in particular expanded very quickly with Japan at that time. But we got over it. We stabilized the situation. Today, Japan, a very friendly ally and good, healthy trade. I just wonder, I'm pretty sure Hillary Clinton would handle this as a professional with a lot of experience and not do anything untoward. I'm not sure what Trump would do. I think as a president, he would have a lot of authority to revoke international agreements of various kinds. He said he's going to do it. I certainly, if he becomes president, I certainly hope he listens to his advisors and talks it over and thinks about it very carefully before creating a trade war.
Victor, one of the biggest areas of friction between the United States and China is the South China Sea. Just a few days ago, the United States sent yet another destroyer into the waters of China's Xi'an Islands, and the China Daily newspaper described that action as stirring up more trouble in the region. Do you think that the U.S. and China can make progress, resolve their differences over this?
The United States is not a claimant to any territory or atoll or island or reef in the South China Sea. And the United States' claim is for the protection of freedom of navigation. China is also a champion for freedom of navigation, and if the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea is disrupted in any way possible, China will be the biggest victim. Therefore, actually, if the real issue is really freedom of navigation, then China and the United States can really amicably sit down at the same table and talk about it. But the danger is some countries using the so-called freedom of navigation as an excuse to achieve other purposes, and China is firmly opposed to that. And I would say that if the United States keeps probing into the South China Sea by sending its warships within the 12-mile territorial sea area of China, then don't be surprised if one day Chinese warships will sail off the coast in California or Virginia. That may happen, actually. China has the abilities to do that. And if that happens, don't blame China for using the same excuse of freedom of navigation to sail off the coast in the United States. And I hope relations between China and the United States will calm down, and nobody wants to provoke the other side. After all, between China and the United States, peace and stability and engagement are most likely the only viable option, because what else can you get? Confrontation, a war, a complete showdown? That will be destructive of both Chinese interests as well as American interests. Therefore, for China and the United States, the two largest economies in the world, the two most important political powers on the global stage, engagement with each other and dealing with each other with full respect is the only viable option. There is no other alternative.
Abraham, when we look at these two countries, they do have differences, issues that need to be resolved, the South China Sea being one of them, trade issues being another, defense issues being something else as well. What do you see going ahead? Diplomacy, will diplomacy triumph, or will a Trump presidency or a Clinton presidency be more hawkish towards China?
Well, I hope diplomacy is put into effect. There isn't very much diplomacy right now. There's pretense about diplomacy, meetings where you have 100 issues listed and everybody talks about how well they're getting along, and then they go off and you see all sorts of either implicit threats or activities that are controversial. I think it's important to realize that when you do diplomacy, you have to be clear about what it is that supports your interests and what you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. And what we have done, the U.S. in the South China Sea, has been very confused. We make no claim, but we supported the Philippine action, a lawsuit against China, even though, in my judgment, given the fact that I'm a former legal advisor in the State Department, we would never have submitted this kind of a dispute to a tribunal of the law of the sea. So there was a certain amount of pretense and preaching that we engaged in about the South China Sea that undermined our credibility badly with China and resulted in a very, I think, devastating, really diplomatic loss comparable to the infrastructure fund debacle that we engaged in. But with regard to the assertion of maritime rights, I think we should agree on what the rules are, and we should be, and I think we are, being more and more careful about not having controversies, not having confrontations, and realizing that the more open we are with each other in terms of what international law allows, the more stable our relationship will be.
Victor, another point of contention between China and the United States is the planned deployment of an anti-missile system in South Korea, the so-called THAAD system, which the U.S. wants to deploy in South Korea. China has been very critical of that and says that the deployment of that system will upset the balance of power in that region of the world. Moving ahead, tomorrow, a new president. How will that be resolved?
Well, first of all, if our common goal as far as the Korean Peninsula is concerned is to achieve denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, then despite all the provocations from DPRK in more recent years, deploying the THAAD anti-missile system in South Korea by the United States is actually counterproductive rather than helpful to achieving the denuclearization goal on the Korean Peninsula. Why? Because philosophically, by deploying the THAAD missile, DPRK will have no other choice but to further escalate its nuclear weapons system and its launch system and possibly again its anti-missile system. So eventually the stakes on the Korean Peninsula will go higher and higher, and it will be more and more difficult to achieve the ultimate goal of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, we need to question what exactly is the real intention of the United States in deploying the THAAD missile, whether it is really to deal with the DPRK regime or it is designed to really push more and more into the Chinese airspace or the Russian airspace, etc. Therefore, I think by firmly opposing the U.S. deployment of the THAAD system in South Korea, China wants to come to terms with the United States in not threatening each other, because just imagine if China deploys the same anti-missile system in an offshore island in the Caribbean, for example, or somewhere in the Gulf of Mexico, what would the next president of the United States, either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, will react? They probably will go up through the roof in responding back to what China might do. China will not do that because there is greater wisdom and sanity in Beijing. But don't underestimate the Chinese capabilities. If the United States keeps believing that by bluffing against China, it can achieve its strategic goal, it's complete fallacy. Between China and the United States, respecting each other, try to better understand each other will be the better way, and engagement and treating each other as equals, rather than one side try to outsmart the other side and try to overwhelm the other side, either strategically or tactically will be a better choice.
Victor Gao, Abraham Safaya, thanks to both of you for joining us. We are going to take a break right now. When we come back, a look at the changing international order and how it might impact a new U.S. president. And what about Russia? That's next on this special edition of The Heat. Stay with us.